The question is whether the United States will abandon Ukraine, which would be an appalling defeat for American interests. Not since the years before World War II will the U.S. have failed to support security and freedom in Europe, as is apparently what some in Congress want. But yesterday's vote was a piece of good news. That's 67 senators in support of assistance to Ukraine. That's something to work with. The faster it goes through, the better off American interests will be.
Well, as we think about American interests, this was something that the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. spoke with Joe and I about last night. She essentially tried to characterize Ukrainian interests as very aligned with American interests, that basically all of this is about democracy. And just take a listen, if you will, Ambassador, to some of what she told us in this conversation. Here she is.
We have to also show that we can stay the course. And again, today, even though the discussions were difficult, even though it's an election year, of course, there are in every country internal issues that needs to be addressed. But I was so happy to see that, it was a very strong bipartisan support and not yet a final, of course, just the first step in the right direction.
So referring there, Ambassador Fried, to the step the Senate took yesterday, the procedural vote to move forward the supplemental package that would include aid for Ukraine. But to go back to the point you were making about how Western allies are not going to turn away from Ukraine because some of those Western allies are European countries, which are very much still there to support. How much can Europe do, though, if the U.S. decides, if the House of Representatives were to decide, no, we're done? Can Europe really pick up the slack of the United States?
No. Europe doesn't have the weapons or the military industry to make up the shortfall if the U.S. drops out. Europe does have the money, and European leaders and European parliamentarians have told me directly that they need to replenish their stocks. And are willing to pay for it. So this is a question not of European resources or political will, but physical possibilities. Combined, the U.S. and Europe together can help Ukraine fight off the Russians and maybe do much better this year than last year. But the U.S. has to get in the game. This doesn't mean U.S. soldiers on the ground. The U.S. play here is to use our resources, the old arsenal of democracy, to help the Ukrainians fight the good fight. And they can succeed. They can succeed in holding off the Russians and taking the fight to the Russians, especially in areas of Ukraine that Russia occupies. But we have got to do our part.
Ambassador, we spoke with Oksana Markarova about the dual needs for manpower and weaponry. And she made it clear that the ask for the U.S. here, this is about money for weapons, specifically missiles, even more specifically interceptors. If we gave them everything they wanted and needed in this case, though, where do they find the soldiers to fight the war?
Ambassador Makarova really is good. And I think the excerpt of the interview you played shows that. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians are now debating whether they have to call up more of their young men to fight. That's a decision they're going to have to make. But calling up their young men to fight doesn't do any good if they don't have the weapons. The Ukrainians are beginning to make more of their own weapons, and they're doing so in collaboration with European countries. But they need the American weapons. We can provide them. If we do, there is a reasonable chance that the Ukrainians can hold off the Russians on the ground and take the fight to the Russians using longer range rockets and defend themselves in their interior using anti-aircraft systems. There is a reasonable theory of relative Ukrainian success that's available. It's not a long shot. It's a realistic shot, but we have to get off the dime and do what's needed. And by the way, this is not a case of the U.S. supporting a country that doesn't want to fight to save itself. This is a case of the United States needing to support a country that wants to save itself, that is willing to fight, is not asking us to fight for it, but is fighting in common cause with us and in the name of European security. This is a good thing.
Well,
a good
to that
thing to
exact
support
point,
Ukraine.
Ambassador, about it being Ukrainian soldiers fighting so that U.S. soldiers don't have to. That's not necessarily the case if Russia were to attack a NATO country, and Article 5 comes into question, where the U.S. may have to engage in that case. Denmark's defense minister has said within the last 24 hours he thinks Russia could attack a NATO country within 3 to 5 years. Does that timeline seem accurate to you? Does the fate of Ukraine depend on what that timeline might actually look like?
Well, the fate of Europe depends on how well we do in helping the Ukrainians fight off Russian aggression. If Putin thinks he can succeed, he might well consider an attack on one of the U.S. allies in the Baltics to seize some territory and to help take down NATO. Putin is playing a very serious game. We can defeat it. This is not inevitable. But if you listen to the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, and I've listened to it all, it is Putin in his triumphalist mood. He thinks he's winning. He thinks history is on his side. And it is clear, if you know how to read it,